So I'm here today with Professor Michael Allen, who's a professor at the University of Virginia. Professor Allen has studied for many years the Vicārsāgara, which is a very influential and important Vedanta text. For many years he studied it, and he's actually coming out with a book along with his translation of the text. And so welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
I just wanted to kind of jump right into it, why the text is important and who wrote it.
So the text is by a North Indian monk or renunciate, a sannyasi. His name was Nishchaldas. He lived in the late 18th, early 19th century, died around 1863. And he wrote 3 works that we know of, but the Vicārsāgara is really his magnum opus, his most important work. The Vicārsāgara, the Ocean of Inquiry, is a compendium that tries to provide an overview of the tradition of Advaita Vedānta, one of the most important traditions in all of Indian philosophy, from its origins up to a whole 1,000 years of philosophical, theological development. And he tries to do it all in one volume. It's about 300 pages, this text, the Vicārsāgara. And he tries to do it all in one volume for people that don't read Sanskrit, because traditionally Advaita Vedānta is a Sanskrit tradition, making it accessible only to a relatively elite leadership. But Nishchaldas decided to write his work in the vernacular, in an early form of Hindi, closely related to earlier forms of Hindi, Braj Bhasha. So he wrote his work in the vernacular, specifically to make it accessible to a much, much wider audience. And it was hugely successful at this. It was quite widely read across North India in the 19th century, and it was also translated into other regional languages throughout India, into at least 7 or 8 different regional languages. In North India and in South India. It was also translated into English in 1885, and it was translated, the most interesting irony, it was in fact translated into Sanskrit as well. So the text was so important and so widely read that in fact Swami Vivekananda once referred to it, probably in around 1894, he referred to it as the most influential book of its day. He said this book currently has more influence in India than any work written in any language in 300 years. Right? So very widely read, though interestingly, as Vedantic ideas in the late 19th and early 20th century became more widely accessible, right now we take it for granted that anyone can go to a library or bookstore, buy a book on Vedanta, and you can read about the fundamentals of Vedanta, but that wasn't the case in Nishchaldas' day. Right? It was hard to have access to this knowledge if you didn't read Sanskrit, if you didn't study Sanskrit. So nowadays, though, it's so readily available that books like Nishchaldas people have, to some degree, in some quarters, forgotten about, and certainly scholars more or less neglected Nishchaldas' work.
Right.
And that's part of a larger picture, actually, of people thinking of Vedanta as just a Sanskrit tradition, focusing on the Sanskrit texts, instead of looking at all the rich vernacular literature.
What is so interesting for me, coming from the Sikh community, is that, you know, even though this text was written outside of the Sikh community's context, it gets incorporated into the curriculum of different sampradayas, the Nirmala group as well as the Udasi group. And it's used largely to give a foundational basis or understanding of Advaita Vedanta. And it's interesting because we have other texts around the same time within the Sikh community that also translate from Sanskrit, albeit this is not a translation. But there's works from Sanskrit that are made into Braj Bhasha that try to delve into the ideas of Advaita Vedanta. So just, I guess for the viewers at home who may not understand, who don't have not read about Advaita Vedanta, could you kind of give just a brief, A to Z about it?
Of course. So Advaita Vedanta, or first the name, Vedanta, literally means Veda Anta, the end of the Vedas, which refers to the Upanishads, which are the texts that come at the end of the Vedas. They're part of the Vedas. And the Upanishads are the parts of the Vedas that contain metaphysical teachings, philosophical speculation, and there are 2 really great questions that Vedanta, that the Upanishads engage. And the first question is, what is the nature of ultimate reality, known usually referred to as Brahman in the Upanishads? What's the nature of ultimate reality? And then the second great question the Upanishads engage is, what is the nature of the self, the Atman? What is our true nature? So what's the essence of the universe, and what is the essence of ourselves? And the Upanishads were important to many communities over centuries and millennia, and they came to be interpreted in many different ways. And Advaita Vedānta is the school of interpretation that interprets the Upanishads non-dualistically. And that's the meaning of the term Advaita, literally not two, not twofold. So it's the teaching that interprets the Upanishads non-dualistically. And what does that mean? Not only that Brahman is one alone, ultimate reality is one, and there is no second, but Advaita Vedanta also teaches that there is a unity between the self and Brahman. So Advaita Vedanta interprets the Upanishads to say, well, what's the nature of ultimate reality, and what's the ultimate nature of the self? In fact, the answer is one and the same. The self, in its deepest essence, is ultimate reality, right? But realizing that, of course, requires shedding one's false association with the body, with the individual mind, with the sense faculties, etc. So that's the basic teaching of Advaita Vedanta. It's traditionally associated, the great founding figure in this school, though there were teachers that came before him in this lineage, is Shankara, or Shankaracharya, who lived in around the 8th century, wrote commentaries in Sanskrit on important texts for the tradition, wrote some original works as well. And then there's been a continuous tradition since the 8th century of disciples of Shankara, and a lineage and monastic lineages to this day that trace themselves back to Shankara within the Hindu community. But from a relatively early period, right, with the rise of North Indian Bhakti, especially the Bhakti poets who were attracted to a Nirgun path, right, worship of Brahman beyond all qualities, beyond all forms. From a relatively early period, many of these Nirgun poets seem to have felt some kind of sympathy or attraction for the type of metaphysics one finds in Advaita Vedanta. So Nishchaldas, in fact, did not belong to one of these Sanskrit Shankarite monastic lineages. He instead belonged to one of these Nirgun Bhakti lineages. Nishchaldas belonged to the Dadu Panth. Dadu was a 16th century Nirguni, a Nirgun poet, just like in the tradition of Kabir and Guru Nanak as well. And Nishchaldas actually traces himself back in his lineage to Dadu. So to this day, actually, Nishchaldas' text, as you mentioned, has an important place, sometimes in the Sikh community. Also in the Kabir Panth, Nishchaldas' text is still studied and read, and also in the Dadu Panth.
Mm-hmm.